Last week, I did an overview of what makes Southern Ontario special, specifically this little area around the western tip of Lake Ontario, what makes it unique, and what role the eco-park system plays. I'd like to focus in that conversation a bit today, highlight a bit more about what the eco-park system does, and talk about some of the wildlife that you can spot in our neck of the woods. Recap, it is a unique area in Southern Ontario that the eco-park system tries to maintain, connect, and protect. We are a voluntary park alliance, nearly 1,900 hectares between Cootes Paradise Marsh and the Niagara Escarpment. It's a dense and populated area that's urbanizing rapidly. There are a lot of issues at play, but it is also filled with some tremendous wildlife, ecosystems, and important habitat. I see the chat going. Oh, there you go. Thanks, Chelsea. So here is a vision map of the eco-park system. There are two reference points that I think folks should be familiar with. We've got Cootes Paradise and Hamilton Harbor. So whenever I say the eco-park system or the eco-park system study area, this is what I mean. It's areas along sort of Hamilton and Burlington, just outside of downtown Hamilton, around Cootes Paradise, going up to the Niagara Escarpment. This is Highway 5, all the way to Branch Street in Burlington, and then sort of down Plains Road, above the 403 highway, along an area that we call North Aldershot. Like I mentioned last week, it's filled with a lot of interesting plant and wildlife that I'll sort of focus in on for a few minutes. Cootes Paradise is a focal point. It's a river mouth marsh with 16 creeks, 25 kilometers of shoreline, and just a magnificent wetland habitat for a lot of native plants, birds, and fish species. Jackson will mention this a little bit, but it's got a lot of designations on the property. It's a significant area for birds, amphibians, generally a lot of scientific interest too. It's a lot of research that happens in the eco-park or in Cootes Paradise. It's an outstanding natural space. That, and to loop it back to our previous conversation about wildlife corridors and just connectivity in general, it sits at the bottom of several watersheds. It also receives everything that goes down through those watersheds. So if we're concerned about what lives in the marsh, we have to be aware of what's happening around its landscape, its connection to the areas around it. It's also valued by people. It's an awesome place to go birding. It's a place you can get on the water. It has lots of natural value. It's a major flyway for birds to learn about and home to a lot of different other wildlife, like the Blandings turtle, wetlands in the eco-park, or sorry, I keep saying eco-park system. Wetlands in Cootes Paradise are part of what's called an impara, which is an important amphibian and reptile area, noted for the amount of species at risk that are within its waters, including the Blandings turtle. One interesting one that I recently found out is in Cootes Paradise are clams, and a variety of ones that are endangered. That's something you might not see when you first look at it or walk by Cootes Paradise, but they're there. We want to look at the Burlington side of the eco-park system. We're talking about North Aldershot, which contains several ravines, many Carolinian tree species, lots of creeks. The Jefferson salamander calls it home. And since 2012, a really interesting initiative from one of the eco-park system partners, City of Burlington, they've been closing a portion of King Road so that salamanders can do their migration, which I think is really cool. And they're a provincially protected endangered species. If we go down towards like Aldershot proper, we get into the lower grindstone. This is also called Henry Valley of RBG. I really like the photo. It's a really interesting example and kind of shows what ecopark system and connectivity, when we talk about nature in urban areas, is all about. You can see that it's developed areas, whether it's RBG, cemeteries, houses. These are right beside really significant natural areas. It's a really good example of that juxtaposition between nature and developed urban and natural. It's a reminder that for us, we've got to be respectful and engaged with our neighbors, the folks who live here too. The lower grindstone, which is kind of a zoomed in photo here, is rich. It's filled with biodiversity. And I don't know, I think it's kind of amazing that this photo is like 100 yards away from a 400 series highway. Fun fact, if you follow sort of Plains Road and York Road, where it splits off, there is an osprey nest there too. So you can definitely check out and see what they're up to. You don't need to think big when you talk birds either. Here is a common white-throat sparrow. There's a recent study talking about how hearing birds, having birds around your house, going out on walks and seeing birds does a lot for people's mental health. It makes where they live a great place. So even a common small species like this is important when you look at it from that angle. But here's the thing about wildlife. They don't look at or understand property boundaries so much. So when they start losing land and green spaces, they tend to wander. So, if we want to maintain biodiversity, we have to pay attention to this, sort of acknowledge where we build roads, what we put alongside of those roads. They have to support animal and wildlife. And that's kind of where the ecopark system fits in. I mentioned this last week. That's the in-between area we try to work at between our partner agencies and that natural and urban landscape. What are the in-between common issues where we can work together better? This also loops back to that conversation we had about connectivity last week. And we can see really important ecological connections for wildlife in this area and why they're important. I kind of mentioned it last week. The ecopark system, it really isn't a new thing. It's been years and years of collaboration in Hamilton and Burlington to protect these natural areas. One really interesting example was in the 90s, where Dundas citizens were really, really interested and passionate about maintaining open space along Cootes Paradise Marsh and the Niagara Escarpment, keep development out of this area. I mention this because this is the last place that animals can move freely between the Niagara Escarpment and the coastal wetlands of Lake Ontario. So if you look at this map, here's Cootes Paradise. Here's the area I'm talking about. It's also known as Pleasant View, and it rides along the escarpment all the way down to Burlington here too. In 1994, because of a lot of scientific input and the work of these citizens, a decision was made by the province, which effectively held back development in this area. They said that you can develop, but only on a 10-hectare property, which slowed down any kind of construction to a halt. And these rules are still in place, which is kind of neat. And it's that kind of work that brought the ecopark system together in the early 2000s. So I just want to highlight that example. And before I hand it off to Jackson, I'll do, as promised last week, I'll do a quick highlight of an interesting research project we've been doing over the last year. So yeah, we always want to do more to help our partners learn more, be better resources. And one thing we did was what we're calling a wildlife corridor study. It's a lot of math and computer modeling, but with the support of the Greenbelt Foundation, we took a look at our study area and tried to get a sense of where the best ecological corridors are. I won't go into details of how it was necessarily done, but we essentially mapped out electronic versions of our some certain animals to see where these connections exist using public mapping and partner agency mapping. A project like this actually happened back in 2015, but across all of Ontario. These funky looking maps are what the study looked like in our area. So you can kind of see Cootes Paradise Marsh here. Cootes Paradise Marsh here. This is all Hamilton Harbor. The one on the left is that 2015 study. It was done by Bowman and Cortez and was at a 100 by 100 meter value. So each pixel is like a hectare. Not very clear. Our study got that down to 15 by 15 meters, which means much more clarity. 44 times more, if we want to get specific. You can start seeing individual roads and streams, and with our partners, try to make judgments on where we can focus our restoration efforts. Where are some obvious barriers and challenges? We use these models to kind of predict where animals could go, and there are some really interesting results. This thick red line, that's that Pleasant View area. So it was really nice to see that confirmation that yes, that is an important ecological connection between Cootes Paradise Marsh and then the escarpment. What's really interesting is this connection too along the escarpment, suggesting that there are ways to get across. You can also head down towards Hamilton Harbor and Aldershot. What I find particularly interesting are these yellow lines. It's kind of suggesting that this area in particular is sort of a hub between natural areas outside of our study area. You can kind of see these connections coming out here into the Dundas Valley or up here into other areas of Burlington. Now, we didn't have any species that were aquatic, so we weren't able to see how or where the connections were going into Hamilton Harbor. And there was an interesting one here of going into downtown Hamilton. So yeah, this was interesting. It really enforces some of the thoughts we have, and it provides some interesting guidance for our work moving forward. And I can definitely keep you folks posted on how this project comes together and then the next steps. But in the meantime, why don't we hop into why you're all here? Birding 101. So with that, I'll throw the mic to Jackson, who will give us a quick talk on many birds you can spot in this area. Jackson, floor is yours.
You say quick. Don't hold me to that. But I will do my best to connect you folks to birds in our area through our workshop tonight. So thank you very much for having me, Tom and crew, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. This is really neat. I am Jackson Hudecki. I am the Bird Study Group Director for the Hamilton Naturalists Club. I'm also the Special Programs Coordinator at Royal Botanical Gardens, and I've started a weird little Instagram page called Beaks and Geeks. You can find me at any of those locations, and I'm here to chat about something that I'm passionate about, kind of as a hobby, but also because it's just something that's greater than all of us. I think you're here for that reason. I think we all kind of work, if you're working in this industry, for that reason. So I'm happy to be a resource for you tonight and going forth through however we connect on birds, on wildlife, on education, you name it. Feel free at any point to throw anything into the chat. I've got it open. I can see it here. So if you have questions, if you want to know something, I'm just going to talk at you for a bit, but I do want to answer your questions. So if you want to know something, maybe not necessarily, I saw this type of bird in my backyard, what could it be? But feel free to put anything in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer it. If you're not aware of the Hamilton Naturalist Club, we are a 102-year-old organization that got its start by protecting Cootes Paradise back in 1919. Right now, we kind of focus on a 40-kilometer radius from Dundurn Castle, which is what you're seeing here. The Hamilton Naturalist Club is a partner in the Cootes to Escarpment Eco Park project, and we've got multiple properties throughout southern Ontario. We've even just purchased 2 properties in the last couple of years. One falls within the Eco Park, which is just kind of beside the driving range on Highway 6 there in Snake Road. One of the biggest donations made to the club of $250,000 was made to help purchase this property right beside this driving range. And it's this deep ravine, which is a pretty incredible property. And then as well, one kind of up in the Puslinch area, which is pretty cool. But we've been maintaining property for decades now with the hope that it doesn't get developed on. We've removed as many invasive species as we can, and we're trying to let life just occur in our properties. And that's kind of the goal with a lot of this, is just to give nature a space to exist on its own. So it's cheap to become a member of the Hamilton Naturalist Club. We have kind of 1 full-time employee and a couple part-time employees, and the rest of us are just volunteering our time for the greater good. So the HSA, the Hamilton Study Area, if nature occurs within it, there's constant sharing of what is being found around there, so that others could go enjoy it as well. So check out Hamilton Nature across both Facebook and Instagram. I think we're on Twitter too. Either way, we're across social media, so there's lots of different ways to connect. I'm a Fleming College graduate, and then I went on and worked at Ontario Parks at Wasaga Beach Provincial Park for a summer before getting hired at Royal Botanical Gardens. And I've been at RBG for about 12 years now, working in education. And I spend a lot of time at the Arboretum. So a lot of my birding knowledge kind of comes from just wandering these trails. But I'm a born and raised Hamiltonian. I just live, Tom and I are kind of neighbors. I can kind of see where he lives near me. We're just kind of down here near Dundurn Castle. So a lot of my birding occurs, and as a father of 2, I can only really kind of just steal away for an hour here, an hour there. So I do try and spend a lot of time around Cootes. And like I was mentioning, the Hamilton Bird Protection Society is who first helped protect Cootes Paradise from being infilled and developed upon in 1919. Through a lot of some changing of hands, RBG eventually took kind of ownership of it. In 1941, so RBG is in its 80th year this year, which is kind of cool. But it's at one point could have been filled in, and we may not have had what is there today. This is what it used to look like. This is a very early photograph, and of course, it didn't. You can see there's a straight channel through there. That was dredged. That's not how rivers flow. Rivers meander, so it's been tampered with even in this photograph. But lots of emergent plant life, which is great. This is what it looks like now if you've been by, and Tom was showing some photos earlier. So not many plants, and this picture's probably a couple years old too. So there's quite a bit of plant life now emerging through there. I can only imagine what it looked like pre-European settlement. But if you were a bird, and this is a metallic bird here getting a bird's eye view of this area, if you were migrating, this looks like a pretty handsome spot to go land and to rest and to dine and to drink up while you're on your travels. So Hamilton has several IBBAs, important bird and biodiversity areas. There's many in Ontario, but Hamilton, the kind of all of the Dundas Valley and the Cootes Paradise Marsh are designated important bird areas, and it doesn't sound like much. But it basically is significant in that we have so much biodiversity occurring in properties in the Cootes to Escarpment Eco Park project, in those properties that when studied, when looked upon, in seeing the kind of life that's in there, it can't help but designate it as an IBA. And it's not just because we're witnessing birds around it, it's because of the plant and the insect life that is also occurring there. But to be designated an IBA, there's a whole list of criteria, and this is some of that. These are other IBAs, IBBAs in Ontario. So you can see kind of a lot of where there's water is where you're going to encounter an IBA, which is pretty cool. It's a bit of a gap right here in the harbor, and if you're a Hamiltonian, you could probably figure out why. But here's kind of what I mean. This is what's designated in the IBA section, and a lot of bird life occurs in Lake Ontario and around the lift bridge and in Cootes and in the Dundas Valley. And that is because of the depth of Lake Ontario. So all the Great Lakes drain into one another before pouring out into Lake Ontario, before going out down the St. Lawrence Seaway. But it gets shallower the farther west you go and the closer to Hamilton you get. So that has something to do with water temperatures and the kind of life that's found within the water, and then the life that then engages and eats that life underneath the water that maybe we can't see. But water aside, if we're talking about plants, we live in a Carolinian forest zone, which is found nowhere else in Canada except for southern Ontario. And that's pretty significant. I mean, the highest amount of people life live in southern Ontario. The only forest type of a Carolinian forest zone is in southern Ontario, and the highest amount of biodiversity found in the nation is found in the Carolinian forest zone around all of these people. Mind-boggling, but that's where you live, and that's why it's important that what Tom and Chelsea are doing and what Mara and all the partners are doing is important, because we're trying to maintain and preserve and celebrate the biodiversity that is found where we live, which is pretty remarkable. And when you're a bird, I mean, you might not know, you don't know those names. I mean, I don't want to speak for birds, but they're going from habitat to habitat, and they're deciding based on their own criteria of where they are choosing to live and to make and raise their young before migrating, which we're in the heart of migration right now. This is fall migration. I know fall starts tomorrow, but for the last 2 weeks, we've been in bird migration, which has been pretty incredible. And these are just like, some examples of how birds choose to migrate, just to give you a glimpse of how far some of these birds will go. And you can see some corridors that some pick. They'll fly in the mainland before flying right over the ocean, but some will choose to follow the coastlines. All kind of depends on the species. And some birds will just go from almost as far north to as far south as you can get in the Western Hemisphere, which is pretty crazy. For example, this particular warbler, a blackpoll warbler, might migrate over 12,000 miles every year, right? Look at where they choose to go, which is pretty incredible considering the bird's about this big. But let's talk about let's talk about what birds are. Has the warmer temperatures affected migration season patterns? It's maybe a bit too early to tell that. It's likely. I've heard some people kind of surmise that everything's happening 2 weeks earlier this year, maybe in the latter part of this year. So that could be the case. Birds are kind of following, and dragonflies and butterflies migrate as well. And I think they're kind of following the Earth's pull. So there's something that's driving them to migrate. But if they're not finding food, if something's happening to their habitat, they'll of course get started earlier. So the warmer temperatures may have affected that. The amount of moisture may affect that as well. There's a bunch of unknowns right now, but because it's currently happening, it's kind of too early to tell that. But great question, and keep putting questions in the chat. I'll answer them as I go. And I am really talking fast because I have 120 slides in this thing that I'm only just trying to kind of skim the surface right now while I can. I'm not testing you on any of this, mind you. So, but we know it's a bird based on its body type, right? Based on its beak, based on its feathers, based on its wings, based on its tail. And we're just kind of talking at it at a hobby level here. We're not talking at an ornithologist level. I am not an ornithologist. I may never be, but that's okay. You don't need to be. You do not need to be an ornithologist at all, but knowing some terms is helpful, because when you talk to birders, when you're in the field, when you have questions, if someone came to me and started asking me to help identify a bird just based on their memory, I'm going to ask them a series of questions, and I'm going to ask them, like, what patterns did you notice on the bird? And where were some of those patterns? Did you notice it in the face or around the eye or on its cap? Or were there wing bars on its wings? Or what did it look like on its belly or its breast? I might talk about size. You know, I might ask you, like, was it sparrow size, which is pretty small? Was it robin size, which is getting a bit bigger? Or was it crow size or larger? That might help get you thinking about, you know, and when you're looking at a bird and trying to think, like, what am I looking at here? Think about how big it might be, not necessarily like in exact inches or centimeters, but just generally. Is it sparrow size? Is it robin size? Or is it crow size? In between or bigger, or heck, even smaller. Location's important too. If you were to come to me and start talking to me about birds and you wanted to know something, well, where were you? And that could be important. Were you walking through a city park? Were you walking in a farmer's field? Were you near a wetland or in a wetland? Were you in an apartment building or in a building somewhere, or were you driving? Sometimes people are like, oh, I'm positive I saw this, and that. Yeah, what were you doing while I was driving? Were you driving the car? Yes. Oh, so you didn't get the best look at it, but either way, location is important. But regardless of what the bird even looks like or its size, a lot of times you can narrow down what species of bird you're talking about based on some of its behaviors. So hopping, flicking its tail, bobbing its head, is it hidden a lot? Is it just sitting out on a branch, doesn't care if you're there or not? Is it scratching the leaves with its feet? These are things that can help narrow down a particular species, because it might be indicative of just one species. When it's flying, what are you noticing about it? You know, some birds, as they fly, do this skip pattern. Some just book it in a straight line. They don't stop flapping. Some will soar. If it's using its voice, is it singing? Is it trying to attract other birds? Or is it just like giving these little peep, chip notes? Are you looking at a nest? You know, a whole bunch of different things. There's a lot that will determine what species it is you're looking at. And right now, I'm just going to show you a whole bunch of species that occur around here. And this is going to kind of take up the next little bit. So at any moment, put a question in the chat. But you know, location, you know, birding behavior, and now we're going to get into some birds that are found right here in the Hamilton, Dundas, Burlington, Southern Ontario area. Okay. So a lot of these birds will become familiar to you, and some people will be like, "Oh, I don't know anything about birds," and I'll say, "What bird is this?" And they're like, "Oh, that's easy. It's a blue jay." It's like, "Oh, okay, great, good. You're off to a great start. What about this?" And people will be like, "Oh, yeah, that's an easy one. That's a cardinal." Sure, it's a cardinal, but in the birding community, we would try and use its full name. I'm not even going to start on Latin names with everybody. Don't worry about that. Although it is like that's like a global language. Is the Latin names for any living thing. You can talk to someone who does not speak English, but you can connect if you're using Latin names for plants or animals or birds. I'll say, okay, maybe you do know what bird this could be. Someone's like, sure, that's a dove. And yeah, there's a few different species of doves that you can encounter. Some are very rare, but this one is a mourning dove. Mourning because it's got like a very mournful kind of quiet coo that it will give. Now, if you look at this picture here, you may notice that there's, you know, a slight difference in these birds. And when I ask people to try and figure out what it is, usually it's the brown head that gives it away. And that would differentiate two different birds in this family. So the one on the left, most people would say, well, that's a chickadee. You're right, that's a black-capped chickadee. And you'd say, well, is the one on the right then a brown-capped chickadee? But it is not. So we have a black-capped chickadee on the left and in Ontario, and one that hardly ventures down south. This is called a Boreal Chickadee. And it's got that brown head compared to the black head. So if you go to Algonquin Park or farther north and you see a chickadee with a brown head, you're probably looking at a Boreal Chickadee, which is pretty cool. But the most common one we get around here is the black-capped chickadee. Now this one is about chickadee size, and this is actually a bird that is like, you know, a harbinger of winter, because this bird, where a lot of birds migrate really far down south, this bird spends a lot of time up north, but when it migrates, in the winter, it migrates here to southern Ontario and spends its whole winter here. You'll see this bird a lot in the winter, and it's known as the dark-eyed junco. And it's got like a two-tone pattern tail. You can kind of see it there. It's like black on one side and white on the other. They spend a lot of time on the ground, not much time at a feeder. You'll see them on the ground if you do have a bird feeder at home. And yeah, definitely a cool bird. And you can see that it's kind of like two-tone in color, dark on top, white on the bottom. So a very neat bird. Now, these are the same bird. This is the same species. It's not a canary. This is an American goldfinch. And on the right, we're looking at a breeding plumage male, so like highlighter yellow, but this bird will stick around in the wintertime and adapt this kind of more like, you know, dull, muted kind of look, kind of yellowy, but kind of gray and white. So this is what it will change its plumage in the wintertime to look a little bit like this. We get two different species of nuthatches around here, the white-breasted here on the left, and the red-breasted nuthatch. If you ever see a bird going down a tree face first, you're looking at a nuthatch. No other species will do that. It's a special adaptation it has. So if you're like, whoa, that bird's climbing down a tree face first, wait, this guy once told me in a webinar only one species will do that, or one family will do that, and that's the nuthatches. So if it's got a big white belly, it's the white-breasted, and if it's much smaller and an orangey kind of red breast, it's the red-breasted nuthatch. So neat little fact. We have lots of woodpeckers around here. Lots and lots and lots of woodpeckers. So on the left, we have a hairy woodpecker, and on the right, a downy. So a hairy is kind of getting like robin size, and a downy is, you know, a bit bigger than a chickadee or a sparrow. And this is a very important species to a Carolinian forest zone, because this bird chooses to spend the majority of its time in a Carolinian forest zone, and it's called a red-bellied woodpecker. So this is a neat bird. If birders live up north in Ontario and they travel down to southern Ontario, it's often a treat for them to see a red-bellied woodpecker because they don't go very far north. And despite the fact that it kind of has a bit of a red head, it's not a red-headed woodpecker, because we actually have what's called a red-headed woodpecker. You can see how deep red this bird is, or its head is anyways. But we also get the yellow-bellied sapsucker and the northern flicker, and a massive bird. This bird is like the size of a crow. This is a pileated woodpecker, and this thing is huge, and it just like, it will do serious damage to a tree. Very loud as well, but a very, very, very cool species. But like, think about all those woodpeckers I just mentioned to you. That's a lot. That's a lot in one family. In fact, if you're thinking about getting into birds, this is a good time to talk a little bit about field guides, because these babies will help you along your way and kind of give you a bit of a glimpse into just like how many dang birds you can encounter in Eastern North America. And I would suggest, if you do buy a field guide, make sure you're buying one that says Eastern and not just North America as a whole. But definitely something that would be worthwhile to pick up is a field guide. Even Birds of Ontario would be a good starter book if you are looking for a field guide. Now I'm going to get into this bird. Now everyone says that like, oh, you know, when I see this bird, I know spring is here. This bird will stick around all winter long, believe it or not. They just flock up and hang out in forests before coming into our cities and our parks and getting rid of the invasive species earthworms that are around. This is the American robin, and it's in the thrush family. So is this bird. This is its cousin, the eastern bluebird. And they're related to these thrushes, which is pretty cool because they all kind of look alike, but they're all different species, which is pretty incredible. Now, these birds, you'll find them, this one on the bottom left right now, because they kind of specialize in eating berries. And looking at these two birds, they're actually two different species, but they have a lot of similarities, and I love this bird. This bird's really incredible. They've got this neat kind of, you know, updo, hairdo look to it. This black mask, but this highlighter tip yellow tail is a dead giveaway for this species of bird, and it's known as a cedar wax wing. Now, I mentioned the Boreal Chickadee earlier. This bird is a relative of the cedar waxwing. It's called the Bohemian Wax Wing, and it spends a lot of its time in the boreal forests. It will come down in the winter time and look for berries and whatnot, but these birds all are big berry lovers. And the kind of joke in the birding community is that, because berries will ferment and cedar waxwings will eat fermented berries, there's some time where you will encounter some drunk waxwings. They can kind of be, and I've kind of experienced it because I've seen two fly into each other once, just kind of nearby, and they kind of sloppily landed in a tree. So that's just a funny little thing about waxwings, is that they sometimes have a little bit too much fun eating berries. But a really amazing bird, and you'll see them in flocks. You'll see, if you see one, chances are there's 12 to 30 of them near you, which is really cool. So some people will see these birds and they'll just call them little brown birds, or LBJs. You'll sometimes hear little brown jobbies. Because when you look at them, it's like, whoa, there's a lot of similarities going on here. It's kind of like the thrush as well, how there are different thrushes. So we start to look at these birds. It's like, wait a minute, I can kind of see that there are some differences between these. And that's when you can work to test your skills to see if you can narrow down the species when you're looking at these birds. And you can see that, okay, these top two birds, they've got some streaking, but this one appears to be a bit more red than the one on the left here. And, the streaking kind of gathers in a blotch, in dark blotches as opposed to red blotches. And they kind of end around the belly, where these ones go much farther down. It's like, okay, so yeah, we can narrow down the species. And same with these two birds on the bottom. Very similar. The one on the left, a very gray belly, and the one on the right, well, check out this white bib going on here. Oh, and they both have black and white going on in their heads, but the one on the right here has this yellow dot right by its eye. So okay, so yeah, there's a bit of a difference between these two. So song sparrow top left, fox sparrow top right, bottom left white crown sparrow. So on the bottom right, white-throated sparrow. So it's like, oh my goodness, when you start getting into this world of birding, you realize how much there is to learn about it. And that can be a very, very, very confusing and even like disheartening thing if you're getting into this as a hobby, because you start to see things and you're like, you know what, forget about this. I don't know what's going on here. I give up, which is fine. Being discouraged as a birder, as a naturalist, is a completely normal feeling. And you may dive further into it, and you just want to know as much as possible, or it may cause you to throw out your field guide, to actually maybe donate it to somebody. But yeah, it all depends on where you choose to go on your birding journey. And I'm sitting here beside something that would be also very helpful, and that is a pair of binoculars. Now, I've got a very handy dandy pair here. The brand is Vortex, and it's like an 8 by 42, or the 10 by 42 magnitude. So these are pretty strong binoculars, but I would be a terrible birder without these, because they really do allow you to see birds up close and to look for these nuances. Now, can everyone afford binoculars? No. Is Christmas coming? Yes, but you don't need them. They're just super helpful when you do decide to go birding. Here's a few more little brown jobs. House sparrows, which is an introduced species, and same with the house finch, also an introduced species. We find these very commonly in our yards and in our cities. Now I'm going to fly through a bunch of these because I want to be mindful of the time. And maybe Chelsea, you can give me a note on how I'm doing with time so far, because I feel like I'm just throwing a whole bunch of information at you. But when you're walking by a wetland, I want to kind of discourage the thought that you're looking at a duck and you just walk by it. There's a duck, there's some ducks. You really can work to narrow down what species of duck you're looking at. And it might be tough, because when you look at all the brown female birds here, look how similar a lot of these birds look. It can be very, like I said, discouraging when you're looking at some of these birds, because it's just like, geez, it could be one of many. But when you slowly start to break down the patterns on some of these birds, you'll realize that, wait a minute, I can work to ID these. In fact, the winter is an amazing time for birding because we get a lot of open water, and that's where birds, when it's farther north and water and there's more ice, they need more habitat, and they come down to the Great Lakes, they come down to southern Ontario, and you'll find a lot of birders with spotting scopes looking down at ducks, because that's what's around. A lot of the songbirds have left for the winter, but you will get lots of ducks. So that's something neat to keep in mind. And do they interbreed? Yes, we call those hybrids. A lot of waterfowl will mate with other species, and so you'll notice that there are hybrids of certain birds out there. Now, these are all different birds. You don't really get many hybrids of these, but these two birds here on the top right is the same bird, common loon, but this middle one here is breeding plumage, and the one down here is the non-breeding or overwintering plumage. So to make birding even harder, at many times in the years, birds will change their plumage depending on their needs, depending on the habitat, depending on their age even, which again is just more to learn, which is incredible. But they all kind of do the same thing. They're all diving birds. You might look at it and see a bird bloop down. You'd be like, whoa, what was that? And you wait a bit, wait for it to pop back up, and hopefully get a better look at it. But again, all the more to learn. We get ducks that nest in trees and wood ducks. We get these incredible long-tailed ducks that you can find in the wintertime, or even the American coot, which as it swims sometimes looks a little bit like a chicken. We have 3 swan species that occur in Ontario. 2 are native, and 1 is an invasive species. The mute swan is an invasive bird from Europe. The tail is this black hump with its orange bill, but you can encounter trumpeter swans. And then at a couple times of the year during migration particularly, we get tundra swans here, especially in the spring. They'll be passing over sometimes in the thousands with this very like whistling whoop kind of call, which is pretty cool. And believe it or not, we get pelicans passing through Hamilton a couple of times a year as well. They breed in the potholes of the prairies, and so we definitely do get pelicans around here, which is pretty remarkable. We're seeing staging right now occurring of great blue herons and great egrets. So they're beginning their migration thoughts, and they sometimes will gather in big numbers. In fact, if you went down to Cootes Paradise tonight, you might encounter some great blue herons. And on Hickory Island the other night, we counted 18 of them, 18 great egrets. But we've seen over 40 in one night. They go there to roost. What time of year do pelicans show up? Usually in the spring. So they follow the coastline up, and then they just kick right across some of them, and they'll see coots, and they'll just fly down and land for a couple of days. So sometimes we'll get 1 or 2. Sometimes we'll get 9. Sometimes they stay around for a day or 2. Sometimes just a couple hours. Sometimes a week. So you never know. I've only got about 8 minutes left here, so I'm just trying to scooch through some of these. Both of these birds are bald eagles. I saw 2 adults today. I was driving over the high-level bridge, and 2 adult bald eagles flew right over me. White head and white tail, big dark body. But if you see one with this mottled look to it, there's a good chance you're looking at an immature bald eagle. And yes, we get them. They breed on Cootes Paradise. They had 2 eaglets this year. And there's 3 young that have been hanging out the last couple of years. So the other day we counted 7 bald eagles on a birding walk I was on at RBG. And then osprey. Tom was mentioning an osprey nest at the corner of Plains Road and kind of Highway 6 area, and they predominantly eat fish, which is pretty cool. And they do not stick around in the wintertime. This is the nest on Cootes that we built to attract them way back in the late 2008, 2009. And osprey nests love these big platforms, so you'll often see that. Raptor migration is big right now, so we've got red-tailed hawks, red-shouldered hawks, Merlin. We've got Cooper's hawk. We've got sharp-shin hawk. The fastest animal on the planet is a peregrine falcon that has been clocked at reaching speeds of over 350 kilometers per hour. We get snowy owls, great horned owls, northern saw-whet owls that are only about this big, and vultures flying around in big kettles. You'll see these spring, summer, and fall, and not so much in the wintertime, only eating dead animals. A very cool raptor. Not a raptor, but we get northern shrike around here that impale their prey on thorns, which is a very crazy thing to do. So sometimes known as the butcher birds. We get lots of birds that specialize in grasslands like bobolink and grasshopper sparrows, and eastern meadowlarks. We're at kind of the tail end of warbler migration. So we get yellow-rumped warbler, yellow warbler, pine warbler, black-throated green. Blue-gray gnatcatchers occur around here, tufted titmice, gray catbird, northern mockingbirds, red-winged blackbirds, ruby-throated hummingbirds, Baltimore orioles, rose-breasted grosbeak. Like, look at the biodiversity that occurs in the Hamilton and Burlington area in the eco park system. It's incredible. These birds look like tropical birds to me. When I first learned that we've got scarlet tanagers and indigo buntings breeding in the area, I was blown away. These look like they live in the Amazon rainforest, but they're found around here. Aerial insectivores in tree swallows, barn swallows, northern rough-winged swallows, or chimney swifts occur here. And we've got wrens living around us, Carolina house, winter, and marsh wren. And rounding back into the city, you know we've got crows, American crows, rock doves, and ring-billed gulls, herring gulls. There's actually in the birding world that, there's no actual one bird known as a seagull. These are all the different types of gulls that occur in North America. So we never refer to them as seagulls. In fact, we don't really have an ocean around here. If you're going to call them something, call them a bay gull. But these are all the different kind of gulls that can occur around here. So this is just kind of a running joke in the birding community. So this is over just 60 species of birds. And in 1 year, we get over 300 species, millions upon millions of birds passing through the Hamilton area every migration. So millions and millions of birds. But there's a reason why people are so keen on birds around here. And there's levels, there's tiers to your birding should you choose to enter into this world, because it's great and incredible to go for a walk and to observe birds around you. It's cool to feed them if you're doing it properly. It's great to join clubs and to attend talks, to join walks, to buy binoculars, to be observing these birds. You can just be working on that if you choose to. And then the more you start to learn about it, the more involved or the less involved you can get. It's totally up to you. But as professionals are watching birds and as we're studying the data, there is concerning trends in certain species. And again, this can be things that you can look up on your own time, but we're looking at the decline of millions of birds over the last 30 years. And every year, certain populations trend downwards, especially some of those aerial insectivores, and which can be perhaps attributed to the higher use of pesticides around North America in certain locations that are lessening the insect population, which in turn lessens the bird population, because we know they're all part of the food chain. Birds are incredible at controlling certain populations of other life occurring around here. We know that life thrives in a web. We know where there's biodiversity. We've got a lot of great life occurring, but when we start seeing species disappearing, we start getting into more monocultures or very, species dominant areas. And we don't want that. We want to have a lot of diversity around here. So you could carry your birding forward and contribute as a citizen scientist and submit your to an app called eBird, which is observed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology through down in the United States or even Birds Canada. And they analyze the data of everyday birders like you and I just by what you submit into eBird. Now, again, that's a few levels up. So again, don't get too concerned about it. You can keep track simply in your own notebook. I for the longest time was just keeping my bird sightings in this book here, and I'd write down what I'd see and maybe some dates. And then when I got into eBird, it keeps track of your lists for you, which is pretty cool. But just know that anyone can be a birder. You don't need to be a pro. You don't need to know all these species. You just step outside. You just observe, slow down, and just hang out. Stop in a spot, sit, quiet your body, quiet your mind, take your headphones out, and just observe what's going on around you. Because that's where that greater appreciation for nature is going to occur, is when you stop and look at it. A lot of people, when they hike, they're just moving. They want to get out, move their bodies. Great, no problem. They want to walk with a friend, catch up. Great, no problem. But you might notice that there's like, you're around a corner and there's 5 people standing there completely silent. And they're observing and they're listening to the birds that are around them. And then that might force you to slow down a little bit as well. And then when you're slow, when you stop, is maybe when you'll start to hear some pips and some cheeps and some things happening around you. And that then connects you closer to that creature and closer to this planet, because we are living in a really weird time right now. And we hear the word crisis a lot. We hear the term biodiversity crisis, which is why so many people are doing what they're doing, because trying to observe it so then we can talk about it. And talking about it with you, and then you talk about it with your family, and it's just this grassroots movement. So all of these organizations are accepting of anybody from anywhere at any skill level. We want you to be a part of this world, and we welcome you to it. So hopefully that wasn't too much. Hopefully you're able to glean something from that. And I'm going to stop talking so I can throw it over to Mara, and she can chat with you a little bit about the next steps of this, and that is some etiquette. So thank you, Mara, over to you.
Thanks, Jackson. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. Hello, I'm Mara. I'm from the Bruce Trail Conservancy, and I work there as an ecologist. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about trail etiquette, or etiquette when you're going out and maybe observing birds, or maybe you're just hiking, whatever it is you're doing. And I hope that I can sort of explain the link between trail etiquette and wildlife conservation and bird conservation, because they really go hand in hand. And so I hope that if you're interested in birds, you're probably interested in protecting them, and you'll be interested in knowing how you can do that when you're out in nature on the trails. And for those of you who were here last week, some of this is going to be review, so I'm going to go quick through some things. But again, I hope that I can sort of make that link between the birding and the etiquette. Before I get into the etiquette, I just wanted to quickly talk a little bit about the Bruce Trail Conservancy. A lot of people know the Bruce Trail Conservancy for the Bruce Trail, which is a wonderful hiking trail through Southern Ontario. But the Bruce Trail Conservancy is actually a lot more than that, and we do a lot of conservation work as well, because our mission is preserving a ribbon of wilderness for everyone to enjoy forever. And so working with this organization, it means you get to see things from both sort of the side of hiking and trail use, and also from the conservation side. And so we really strive to make sure that people can access nature and go out and see birds and other wildlife, while doing it in a sustainable way that has a minimal impact on the birds and wildlife that you're trying to enjoy. And so just to sort of lay down some groundwork, trail etiquette basically just means the set of, say, rules you follow, or just sort of a code of behavior that makes sure that we're respecting everyone around us. And when I say respecting everyone, that means respecting everyone else that's on the trail, respecting the land and all the organisms that live around you when you're walking on the trail, and of course, respecting people that might own the land that you're walking on as well. Because a lot of people don't realize that some of the trails in our area, including the Bruce Trail, actually pass through private land as well. And so you're there sort of because of the generosity of different landowners in the area. And so trail etiquette serves a number of different purposes, and I think a lot of these are probably common sense for people, but it really comes down to making sure that you're using a trail in a way that makes sure it's a positive experience for everyone out there, and I don't just mean people. So making sure that we're minimizing our impact on sensitive plants and animals, keeping everyone safe, and also respecting the people that maintain these spaces, people that are doing important restoration work. When you follow the trail etiquette, you're sort of showing respect for the work that's been done there. So for example, the Bruce Trail is maintained by over 1,500 volunteers. They make sure they're in good shape. They make sure that maybe there's viewing platforms for you to see birds, or waterfalls and that kind of thing. And so when you are sort of respecting staying on the trail, you're sort of respecting the work that they do as well. Most of what I want to talk about today, though, is protecting sensitive plants and wildlife, because this is birding 101. And so for most of the talk, I want to sort of link trail etiquette and birding. Before I do that, I just wanted to share a few basics. Again, a lot of these are common sense, but these are sort of basic trail etiquette rules that I think you'll find should be followed kind of no matter where you are. Things like staying on the trail and obeying any signs that might be there. Things like packing out your trash, leaving nature as you found it. That means leaving rocks and sticks and flowers, leaving them in place for everyone to enjoy. But one thing that I wanted to highlight, and I think this is especially important over the last year and a bit, where we have lots of people maybe going out to natural spaces for the first time as they try to sort of escape the confines of their houses, is just planning ahead and preparing. And that just might mean maybe you visit the website of whatever place you're going to see and see if there's anything that you need to keep in mind before you get out there. So things like, do you need to make a reservation? Anything to keep in mind for parking? And do they have particular trail etiquette rules that they're asking you to follow? And so that's always a great idea before you get out there to make sure that you have a good experience. And I've just thrown down at the bottom, brucetrail.org is where you can find all of our information about our trails. And I know that there are similar web pages for other areas in the Hamilton-Burlington area as well. So I want to highlight a few of the key trail etiquette points that I think are most important for protecting wildlife. And the first one is actually staying on the trail that's been created for your use. And I know sometimes it can be tempting to kind of wander off and see if there's something off trail that you can't see from the trail, or it's tempting to try to get a little closer to that waterfall to get the perfect photo. But I kind of want to point out that there's actually a lot of thought and work that goes into creating trails and deciding where they go. So for example, the Bruce Trail Conservancy will purchase properties so that we can protect it in perpetuity and so that we can place trail on the property. And so when we purchase a new property, the first thing we do before we lay down any trail, blaze any trails, is we take an inventory of what's there. So that means ecologists like myself will go out, will survey, are there rare or sensitive plants here? Are there birds nesting in certain areas? Is there an important wetland over here that we need to be mindful of? So that when we lay the trail, we're actually routing it in a way that will sort of avoid impacts to the most sensitive species. And so when you're on a trail, you know that you're on a route that has been designed with nature in mind. It's been designed so that you can maybe view birds from a safe distance, or it's been designed so that you can see interesting plants without trampling them. And so by staying on the trail, you're making sure that your footprint is sort of contained and that you're not accidentally trampling on sensitive plants, for example. And this goes to my second point, which is that trails really concentrate disturbance in a small area. Because even when we're following all the rules, I'm sure everyone's had the experience of as you're walking closer, you maybe see a squirrel and all of a sudden it freezes. And so you know that it knows you're there. Sometimes you can even see its little heart beating and you know that it's getting a bit stressed, it's getting nervous as you get closer, and then maybe it scurries away. So every time we walk through an area, we're causing the animals a little bit of stress. They're spending a little bit of energy to maybe escape from us or to keep an eye on us. And that's energy that they need to survive and raise their babies and all that kind of thing. And so when we stay on a trail, we're basically concentrating our disturbance in one area and leaving the rest of the area as sort of a refuge for those animals. And so I think the photo on the right here kind of illustrates what happens when we start creating our own trails outside the main trail, is that it widens that area and area. And so there's more of an area of disturbance and less areas for animals to take refuge. And something that some people don't know is that a lot of birds actually nest very close to or right on the ground. And so by staying on the trail, we're making sure that we're not stepping on things that might be actually right beneath our feet. So for example, this photo on the left is a nest of some sort of thrush species. And this was directly on the ground, right beside a mossy rock, fairly close to a trail, close to the Bruce Trail further north. And so it just kind of illustrates that there's sensitive and there's really important things happening on either side of the trail. And we want to be able to observe those without interfering too much. The other important point that I think kind of is relevant for our talk today is leaving nature as you found it. And when I go out in a forest or a meadow, I think of it as I'm entering somebody else's home. There are animals that are raising their children there. This is somebody else's home. And so in somebody else's home, you have certain things that you do. You act like a good house guest. So that means cleaning up after yourself. And it also means you probably wouldn't steal things from your host's house. And what I mean by that is we want to leave everything where we found it. So it may not seem like a big deal to pick up a rock and take it home, or a stick or a log, but remember that there's lots of animals that live under those rocks and those logs and rely on that habitat for survival. So I've got a picture of an eastern newt here and many salamanders and things. They live under those rocks and logs. And so when you have multiple people visiting an area, one rock turns into 100 rocks, and all of a sudden we're kind of affecting the habitat. And the last couple of points I have here are, again, just like any house guest, you avoid excessive noise and you respect personal space. And I think this is really important for birding because, again, during the spring, there's lots of birds nesting, we've got young around, and we want to just minimize the stress that we cause because it already takes a lot of energy to raise young and that kind of thing. And so we just want to be able to observe in a respectful way. And I think Jackson's kind of already mentioned this, but it actually improves your experience as well. And one thing that I know Jackson does with birding groups is he makes us all, because I've gone on many walks with Jackson, is he'll say, let's take a moment, we'll stop moving, we'll stop talking, and we'll stay very still. And you hear how the forest comes alive when you just quiet down for a minute. And so thinking about that as we're moving through the forest is maybe being a little more still, a little slower, a little quieter, and you'll actually probably see and hear more that way as well. And finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about pets because I love pets, but also because managing your pet is really important when you're with wildlife. Because I think Tom kind of touched on this, this is a really densely populated area. And so the little urban green spaces that we have are really, really important for the wildlife. They're sanctuaries, they're refuges from, all the pressures of urban development. And so when we're there, we want to make sure that it really is a sanctuary, a safe place for the birds. And if we have dogs running off leash and they're sort of going any which way, maybe they're chasing animals, then they're causing those animals and those birds to use up energy, avoiding them that they could be putting towards surviving and raising young. And especially in such an important area where we have such biodiversity of birds and wildlife, it really is a special place to enjoy. And so we want to make sure that we're giving those birds the space they need to survive. And so when it comes with dogs, it's keeping dogs on a leash where, unless you're in a no leash or an off leash zone, respecting areas where maybe dogs aren't allowed, because those areas probably are like that for a reason. Maybe there's rare birds that you don't know about that we're trying to protect in those areas, that kind of thing. And then of course, cleaning up after your pet. And sometimes I think people bag their dog's poop and then leave it on the trail thinking they're going to come back for it, but then perhaps forget, because this is something that we see along the trail a lot. And even if you think you're going to come back for it, you can imagine that the person behind you now sees that and goes, oh, okay, is this what everyone's doing? So it kind of sets a bad example. So those are kind of the things that you want to think about with your pets. And I think sometimes I hear from people, well, dogs are basically just like, domesticated coyotes, and coyotes are natural predators. So what's the big deal? Don't they fit into the environment? And I think the important thing to remember there is when we're in a really densely populated area, it's all about cumulative impact. So maybe one dog once a day isn't a big deal, but think about all of the people bringing their dogs into an area, and suddenly you've got many, many impacts. Natural canines would travel in small packs and could have large territories. And when you're living in Hamilton, I'm sure you can see just how many dogs are concentrated in a small area. So by kind of keeping all of the dogs on the trail, we're making sure that wildlife has space as well. So that's kind of my spiel on etiquette. And like I said, you can go onto our website or websites of other places you're visiting and learn more if you have specific questions. Now that we know sort of how to act on the trail, I wanted to talk a little bit about where you can go to see birds. And I think Jackson's given us some great suggestions too. And one of the things you can think about, I'll give highlight locations in a minute, but if you're trying to decide where to go birding, I think it's important to just think about, well, what does a bird need to live? You know, it needs shelter, food, water. Think about where maybe a specific bird might nest. Does it nest on the ground? Does it nest in holes, in dead trees? That kind of thing. And so when you start thinking like a bird, you can start to predict where you might see certain birds. For example, if you're trying to see small warblers and sparrows that might need to take shelter from predators, maybe you want to visit a place where there's lots of shrubs and sort of greenery that they can hide in, for example. So, and also if you want to see a diversity of birds, you want to go to a place where there's a diversity of habitats. So maybe you can go to a location where there's a bit of meadow, there's a bit of forest, you've got a pond, and so you know you're going to see a diversity of birds that way. And Jackson's already talked about this, but timing is also really important. Some birds only fly through here for a certain part of the year, so you can be thinking about time of year when you're deciding when to go birding. So as promised, I'm just going to highlight a couple spots within the Cootes to Escarpment Eco Park, which are particularly good spots for birding, and this one's already been mentioned. The Royal Botanical Gardens, the Arboretum on the North Shore, and Princess Point on the South Shore are really like the hot spot for birding in Hamilton. They have a diversity of habitats, like I already mentioned. It's going to attract diversity of birds, and you've got all of these amazing water birds in particular. And I particularly love going and seeing the bald eagles. In the wintertime, you'll see them out on the ice, which is really, really neat. And then you'll see all of these migrating birds as well that are stopping on their way south or north, depending on the time of year. The second spot I wanted to highlight is in sort of the Waterdown area. This is Kerncliffe Park and City View Park right next door. And this is a really interesting location because Kerncliffe Park actually used to be an old quarry. But now that it's retired, it's this mix of little ponds where stone has been quarried. You've got wetland, there's open meadows and forest as well. So again, you've got that diversity of habitats. And at City View Park, you also have excellent lookouts over the escarpment where you can see soaring birds like turkey vultures as well. So you get a lot of interesting wetland birds, the Virginia rail, red-winged blackbird, and you also get some interesting other wildlife. I've seen water snakes, a variety of turtles and frogs in the wetland area, so I definitely recommend checking that one out as well. And that is it from me. So I'm going to pass it back to Tom to moderate some questions, I believe.
Awesome. Thank you, Mara. Thank you, Jackson. That's awesome. It's always nice to hear from you guys.